My guest, Dr. Peter Gøtzsche. He is the director of the Nordic Cochrane Center in Copenhagen and a professor of research design and analysis at the University of Copenhagen. Peter's the co-founder of the Cochrane Collaboration, formed in 1993, that conducts the world's most thorough independent analysis of healthcare research. He is the author of 4 books, including Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Corrupted Healthcare, and most recently, he published Deadly Psychiatry and Organized Denial. Thank you for being here today, Peter.
You're welcome.
All right, so the first question, I always like to learn kind of people's motivations and their interests. So why did you form the Cochrane Collaboration?
We were around 80 people who met in Oxford in 1993, who were very frustrated because we could not trust the published literature on healthcare research. So we needed to do much better. And what we decided to do was to collect the randomized trials of various interventions and then read them critically and summarizing them in a database. And also doing a statistical summary, which we call a meta-analysis, if there is more than one trial in the same area. And then we update the Cochrane reports when new trials come along, when it's needed. So this has helped create a more reliable literature of research reviews so that we know more about which interventions work and which do not, and which cause more harm than good.
So what does this process look like? So from what I read about on your website, you actually have collaborators in over 100 countries that are working towards this project. So how do you actually manage to collaborate and kind of include all these different contributors? What does that process look like?
We are very much funded by governments, and we don't take industry money, of course. That would ruin our credibility. And there are Cochrane centers in many countries. Mine in Copenhagen opened at the same time as the Cochrane Collaboration 25 years ago. And then we have around 50 so-called review groups. They function, all of them, like a medical journal. So one, for example, specializes in liver and gall duct diseases. And that functions like an ordinary medical journal. So that is the basic structure we have. And we have perhaps 20 or 30,000 collaborators in more than 130 countries.
Wow. So now to say that you're an outspoken critic of psychiatry would probably be an understatement. So tell me, how did you come to write your book, Deadly Psychiatry? I know it seemed like part of this journey started a little bit when you were writing Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime. So how did that book come to be? How did you end up doing that research?
It started much earlier. 11 years ago, a person came to me and wanted to do a PhD comparing benzodiazepines with depression pills, to see if history repeats itself. And she found out that this is indeed the case. For example, if people stop suddenly taking depression pills, many will get abstinence symptoms. And they are very much the same as when you stop a benzodiazepine. These are the pills that in the old times were called nerve pills, like Valium and Librium, and these names you are probably familiar with. So she found out that contrary to what the psychiatrists were telling the world, the abstinence symptoms were about the same. But the psychiatrist told the world back then, and still do, that you do not become dependent on depression pills, whereas you do become dependent on benzodiazepines. This is totally wrong. You do become dependent on both types of drugs. So when I found this out together with her, I took an interest in psychiatry, and I now have 5 PhD students who work with psychiatric drugs and psychotherapy. So we have published a good deal, so it was pretty natural for me to write a whole book about it. I consider psychiatry the worst area in healthcare, and have actually come to the conclusion that current day psychiatry does more harm than good, because psychiatrists and general practitioners and pediatricians and others, they use so many psychiatric drugs that the effect of that is that you have a whole specialty that is actually harmful for patients.
Now, you mentioned a minute ago something about the trials and the studies done on placebos. Did you mention that a second ago?
No, but I can mention that.
Yeah, there was something I read in your writing that was really like eye-opening about the flaws in a lot of these studies with regard to placebo. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, psychiatric drug trials are generally quite unreliable. And one of the reasons for this is that you almost always, you take people who are already in treatment. So if you do a depression trial, you take people who already get depression pills, then you randomize them to placebo or another depression pill. And what does that mean? It means that you harm those who get placebo, because some of these get cold turkey symptoms, just like if you suddenly stop heroin or alcohol. So some of these cold turkey symptoms, abstinence symptoms, they can actually be depression. And then you conclude that, okay, we have a new depression pill, it seems to work, but we forget to tell the world about that we harmed those assigned to placebo by giving some of them an artificial depression, namely an abstinence depression. Do you see the point? And then there is another big problem with trials in psychiatry, and that is that these drugs have many side effects. So even though they are called double-blind, they are not really double-blind. Many patients and psychiatrists have guessed whether they get an active drug or a placebo. And since the outcomes are highly subjective, like if you sleep better and feel better and so on, then when the trials are not adequately blinded, we know that the effect is being exaggerated. So there are many flaws in psychiatric drug trials. And even despite all these flaws, depression trials have not found an effect that is clinically relevant. The effect that is measured in these trials is clearly smaller than the smallest effect that is relevant for the patients. And I can illustrate that by an example from our research. We have found, which will be defended in a week's time in a PhD, that patients who get depression pills, they leave the trial before the trial is over to a larger extent than if they get placebo. This actually means that placebo is a better pill than a depression pill, because when a patient decides whether to stay in a trial or leave it, that patient weighs benefits and harms. You see my point? So that when people say goodbye to a greater extent when they get an active pill than a placebo, it actually means that the placebo is the better drug.
So is there a way to do a study where you, because it seems like side effects are one way that you could, if you're in a double-blind study and you're experiencing side effects, then you can be pretty confident that you're on the active drug. Yes. So is there a way that they've incorporated side effects into the placebos to try to balance that out? So they do that, and is that effective?
No, they did that a very long time ago, in the 60s. So it's about 50 years ago. Some trials were made where a substance called atropine was added to the placebo. And this substance can give you dry mouth, constipation, and blurred vision. just like depression pills can. So these trials were better blinded, and they didn't show an effect. So if you put something in the placebo that gives people side effects, you can no longer measure an effect. So what we see in these trials is a deception. These drugs don't really work, and they don't help people get back to a normal life. They don't help people come back to school, come back to work, save relationships, and so on. Quite the contrary, at least half of the patients who had no sexual problems before they were put on a depression pill, they will get sexual problems when they get the pill. So these pills have quite pronounced harmful effects, and they can also increase the risk of suicide, which you undoubtedly know about.
So let me ask this. In one of your books, you described pharmaceutical companies as being a mafia of sorts. Can you describe, and part of it was that you said that they were, buying off professors and doctors. Can you describe a little bit about when you say that they're buying off professors and doctors, what does that really look like? What do you mean by that when you say that they're being bought off?
Oh, in our little country, for example, where we just have perhaps 25,000 doctors, around 4,000 to 5,000 of these doctors, or maybe more, are in some way financially related to the drug industry. This is a huge amount of Danish doctors, and they don't buy the junior doctors. They start buying the professors and chiefs of department and so on. And you may ask, how do they buy them? Well, they ask them, do you want to be a consultant for us so that we can ask you questions? Or do you want to be on our advisory board and then we pay you for that? Or they make fake trials that are not really scientifically valuable, but are marketing ploys. And then they attach a large number of so-called clinical investigators to them that get something out of this relationship. So there are many ways of buying doctors, and the research literature shows very clearly that, of course, you become influenced when you benefit from your relations to the drug industry. Research has shown that these doctors who get drug industry money, they generally use far too expensive drugs. They use drugs more than other drug doctors do. And they use sometimes drugs that are even more harmful than older drugs that are far cheaper. So this corruption is clearly harmful for patients.
Right. And so what about doctors that let's say, begin doing work and getting paid by pharmaceutical companies? Is it hard for them to then become detached from that relationship? Are they kind of stuck in it? Is there, consequences if they then speak out and change direction? Like what happens? Like, now, are there examples of doctors that were originally funded by pharmaceutical companies that have broken away?
Oh yeah, one of the more well-known examples is an American called Daniel Carlat, who was a drug salesperson. So he gave lectures sponsored by drug companies. And when he found out how bad all this was, he just quit. It's a moral issue. Every single person needs to decide for themselves whether they want to become corrupt or whether they want to be able to look themselves in the mirror in the evening and in the morning. That's up to every single individual. You're not obliged to become corrupt.
Now, in your book, and actually even in an essay, I think it was that I read, you talked about these famous myths about psychiatry. I think there was either 5 or 10, you called them the famous myths of psychiatry. Yeah. Can you talk about what these different myths are and how they came to be, and also why it is that these myths persist even after they've been debunked?
Yeah, That was 4 years ago. I can't remember all of them now.
No, it's, yeah, you don't have to remember all
I
of them.
have,
I'm
I have
specifically
found,
interested in
I have found so many, I have found so many other myths in these last 4 years. But let's start with some of the biggest ones. One of the biggest lies in psychiatry is that you are ill because you have a chemical imbalance in your brain, and that this is like insulin, that if you need insulin, it's very good to give you insulin, but you don't need anything if you're a psychiatric patient. There is no chemical imbalance in your brain. This has never been shown to be correct. And yet, it is still the case that roughly half of the patients, they have heard this lie and they still hear about it today, although it's a complete myth. And it's not even a myth, it's a very harmful one. Because if you believe in it, that there is something wrong with you that a drug can fix, then it becomes more difficult for you to decide to come off the drug, even though it might harm you. You start to believe that you are some kind of defect and that you need this drug for the rest of your life. That's the other harmful thing, that then you go on year in and year out with that drug. So this is one of the biggest lies and most harmful lies in psychiatry, and it's still alive and well. It's very, very sad, because the reality is that almost no one really needs a psychiatric drug. And if they need one, it should be only for a very brief period of time. And then they need to come off it very quickly, because if you continue with a psychiatric drug for a long time, as far as I can see, every one of them is harmful.
So then, if you mentioned, in these acute situations, so what would that look like in terms of these drugs being used in an acute fashion? Would there be certain guidelines? Like, what would that actually look like in practice? And is it really even possible?
No, I mean, people are almost irrigated with psychiatric drugs, particularly in America, where you have totally unrestrained capitalism compared to most of the rest of the world. And so you have one of the highest consumptions of psychiatric drugs in the world. And really, you very rarely need a psychiatric drug. You need to think of psychiatric drugs as something that is very unspecific, like alcohol, like morphine, like heroin. This is not something you should take for your whole life. If you are in a terribly bad shape and cannot sleep, then a sleeping pill may help you for a few nights, but very quickly the effect wanes off and is gone. So the rule is that you should not use a sleeping pill for more than 2 weeks. And I even believe that very few people ever need a sleeping pill, because if you don't take it and you lie awake all night, then you are not as bad as you would think you are the next day, because your thoughts wanders away even though you're awake. So you do get some relaxation even though you don't sleep. You see my point? And then the chances that next evening you will be so tired that you will sleep naturally. I have been in that situation many times because I work a lot, and once in a while I have difficulty sleeping, not very often, but even if I lie awake for 4 or 5 hours, I don't care. Even if I just sleep for 2 or 3 hours, I don't care. I get through the next day and then I sleep well the next night. So I know psychiatrists, very good ones in many countries, who never use psychiatric drugs. Absolutely never. They use human interaction, empathy, you might call it love, to show that you like your patient and try to help your patient with psychotherapy. That's That's what we should be doing, really.
So if you had psychiatrists that were using psychotherapy as treatment, would that not include a total different set of training to actually go down and become like a psychologist, or are there a lot of psychiatrists that do have the training to be effective as through talk therapy?
Well, I have something that is bothering me, popping up all the time. I've tried to get rid of it. It's an error with the new Windows 10. So it suddenly gives a noise, so I get distracted. So you need to repeat your question.
Sure. You mentioned that some good psychiatrists are using talk therapy.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, somebody that was going to go through that path, would they be better off becoming a psychologist that would have maybe more specific training on doing talk therapy? Or as part of becoming a psychiatrist, do people get trained effectively enough in being good talk therapists? Is that something that all of them have access to, or would they have to go through new training, I guess is what I'm asking.
Oh, yeah. Some psychiatrists are not trained in psychotherapy. And those who are trained are generally not trained as much as psychologists are, because psychologists are not allowed to prescribe drugs. So they're generally far better in delivering psychotherapy. So I believe the psychiatrists made the wrong choice in the 60s and 70s in America, when they were under pressure from competition of the psychologists who were more popular than the psychiatrists back then. And then the psychiatrists invented this biological psychiatry. Oh yes, there's something wrong with your brain, and now we are going to fix it with a drug. It's a myth. I know of absolutely no psychiatric drugs that can fix anything. They don't cure people. And even though these trials are very biased, the effect you measure in these trials are quite small. This is also true for neuroleptics, which most people call antipsychotics, but it's wrong to call them antipsychosis because they don't cure psychosis. They just knock people down, and they have the frontiers, and as in animals, it's totally unspecific. So it's wrong to call them antipsychotics. And you don't, I have come to the conclusion that you don't need antipsychotics because of them. And they're used in forced treatment, which is totally ethically indefensible. And you might as well give people a benzodiazepines if they are totally disturbed and needs to be calmed down a little. When I lecture and ask patients what they would prefer next time they became admitted with a psychosis, whether they would prefer a benzodiazepine or a neuroleptic, I haven't heard any patient so far telling me, oh, I want a neuroleptic. They all want a benzodiazepine because it's not so toxic.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about this myth of the neurochemical imbalance. So how is it that this myth persists? I mean, you've got thousands of doctors involved with the Cochrane Collaboration. There's even people outside of that are aware that this is a myth. So how is it that with all these people that are doctors that know that there's a misinformation being spread, how is it that this continues to persist?
Well, leading psychiatrists spread a huge amount of misinformation that goes directly against the best scientific evidence we have. And then you can ask, how on earth is it that leading doctors in a specialty knowingly spread misinformation? And this is because psychiatry is built on a myth about having specific drugs and about a chemical imbalance and all these things. And it is very important for psychiatry to sustain this myth, although it is under serious attack these years in several countries. So the whole house of cards will fall, and I think it won't last that much longer before it falls.
Now, what type of advice do you give to somebody? So I spoke with somebody the other day who suffered with, they hear voices, and they actually, I'm pretty outspokenly against forced treatment, but they were telling me that they were actually grateful for receiving forced treatment, that these drugs had helped them and that they had, in some ways saved their life, and they're grateful that, they got locked up in a psych hospital and forced on drugs. So what do you say to somebody that claims that this has been helpful to them?
Oh, that's because they don't know what is going on. They have nothing to compare with. If you have a patient with a psychosis, then the psychosis often has a reason. It often comes when people are under stress, are undergoing a divorce, or a company goes bankrupt or whatever, or sexual abuse and these things. So there is often a reason for them, for the psychosis. And we also know that if you don't treat psychosis with drugs, then many of them go away again. And if a psychosis goes away and you have been forcefully treated with a drug, then you have nothing to compare with. And then you might think it's due to the drug, because I was in a very poor shape and 4 weeks later I'm much better, so it must be because of the drugs. That's how people reason. And this is the very reason that we do randomized trials where half get placebo in order to find out, do these drugs work or not? And when we do these trials, we can see that neuroleptics actually do not work. They do not have an effect that is clinically relevant. So it's a sad thing that some patients, they have this perception that they were helped. This is not to say that patients are never helped. Some people also feel helped by alcohol in a stressful situation, or opium. This doesn't tell us anything about whether alcohol or opium is a good solution to people's problems. It actually isn't. So psychiatric drugs are similar in that respect.
Sure, it makes a lot of sense.
I often, when I debate with patient organizations, particularly those that receive funding from the drug industry, the presidents of such patient organizations, they can, for example, say, oh, but I'm far too critical, me, not them. I'm far too critical because I have these patients who said that a depression pill saved their life. They don't save people's lives. They actually take lives, which I have documented in my book. They're harmful. So on one occasion, I told a president of a patient organization, it is unfair of you to refer to anecdotes, to refer to patients who felt that these pills saved their lives, because those patients who were killed by the pills, they cannot raise from the grave and say in a radio program, these pills killed me. So you cannot use these statements for anything. They're just misleading.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit about your book. You go through and you discuss a handful of different conditions. You mention depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and also dementia. Can you talk a little bit about what you've found in your research about these different conditions?
I found such a huge amount of bias that I have never seen anything like it in any other area of healthcare. The bias in psychiatric research, both in the trials and in observational studies, is just immense. So it's very depressing. It takes many years to get to the bottom of all this before you really feel that you understand it. And when you understand it, you can see it's very bad. That's why I call psychiatry a pseudoscience. If psychiatry was really interested in knowing whether drugs helped people, then they should do long-term trials, placebo-controlled, in people who had never received these drugs before, so that the placebo patients didn't get abstinence symptoms and were harmed. And then you should study outcomes that matter, not some funny ranking scale, but do they function? Do they finish an education? Do they get married? Do they get children? All these things that matter to us. That is what it is about to deal with psychiatric patients. You should bring them back to a normal life. And this, the drugs not only cannot do, but they make it much, much more difficult for people to come back to a normal life. They make it difficult for people to function. Now, if these drugs were like insulin for diabetes, then you could easily see it in our statistics. But what you see in psychiatry is, in all countries, the more psychiatric drugs you use, the more people come on disability pension. They can't come back to a normal life because of the drugs. If the drugs had been so wonderful as a psychiatrist wants us to believe, then disability pensions should go down when we use these drugs far more. Exactly the opposite happens. We have so much documentation that it's very wrong to treat people for years with psychiatric drugs, just as it is wrong to become a chronic alcoholic or a chronic opium abuser or whatever. It is wrong. We should leave our magnificent brains alone as much as we can.
So what do you think it will take to swing the pendulum in the other direction for people to become aware of this? Is it a matter that the more doctors need to be educated about it, or that more patients need to know about this? Where do you think the opportunity for change comes from?
The greatest hope is to have a change from the bottom up. The patients and their relatives need to protest, to demonstrate, to be vocal, to be on television, to write articles, to tell the world we have had enough. We have seen so much misery. Whenever I meet new people and we start talking to each other about what we are doing for a living and so on, I very often ask them, do you know someone in your near family or some of your close friends whom you feel have been badly treated by psychiatry? Almost everyone says yes. Now, if you ask these same people whether they know someone close to them that have been badly treated by cardiologists, rheumatologists, whatever medical specialty you can think of, that's not the answer you will get. There is something fundamentally wrong with psychiatry, and it's about time that the psychiatrists realize this themselves. We could have a much better psychiatry where it would also be much better to be a psychiatrist. It's not nice to force drugs on people. It's not nice to put them in bells or seclusion.
So let's talk a little bit about the use of force in psychiatry. So what have you found in your research, especially I think I read that you've kind of looked in different countries and how force is used in psychiatry and the effect that has. Can you talk a little bit about what you found with specific use of force on people?
Well, that's a long story because what we don't really have are big randomized trials where half of the patients were subjected to forced drugging, for example, and the other half was not, but could choose themselves whether they wanted drugs, whether they wanted psychotherapy or whatever they wanted. These trials have never been done. This is a huge failure in psychiatry. But we have so much indirect evidence that tells me that force is far worse than if we did not have force. Although it can be helpful in some cases, then on average, I have absolutely no doubt that it's harmful that we have force in psychiatry. Just think about human relationships. If you have an extreme power imbalance, whether it is in a marriage, whether it is between a proprietor, a boss, and his staff, it always goes wrong. Even if the intentions are very good, it always goes wrong. And the power imbalance in psychiatry in a closed ward is extreme. So it must go wrong, no matter what your intentions are. When you had slavery in the United States, it was beneficial for the slave owners. But if you ask the slaves, you got another version of reality. That was also extreme power imbalance.
Yeah, and I've noticed, so actually I could share my screen real quick to show you. This is the program guide for the American Psychiatric Association meeting this year. And so you can see the different tracks that attendees can follow. So for example, one of them is about addiction psychiatry. One of them is for children and adolescents. They have forensic psychiatry, which is for people that are in prisons. And then they have geriatric psychiatry, which is for inmates.
Oh, but let me stop you.
Okay.
You started with addiction psychiatry.
Yeah.
And what is that? That is about alcohol, drugs, but we are not talking about psychiatric drugs, but street drugs. Yeah. So the psychiatrists are completely blind to the fact that they have made millions of Americans addicted to psychiatric drugs. They cannot come off them without being helped. They just won't see it. And in many cases, they won't help people. And in many cases, they even don't know how they should help people, because it can be difficult to taper people off a psychiatric drug. You need to have a minimum of knowledge about this. But they're not interested. So I have never seen a course in Denmark about withdrawing psychiatric drugs apart from those I have arranged. And I'm not a psychiatrist.
Right. So what advice do you then have? I guess we could ask on behalf of patients and then doctors. So for doctors out there that might not be psychiatrists, maybe they're general practitioners and a patient comes to them and they want to get off their psychiatric meds, but they are not a psychiatrist. What resources should doctors look at to help their patients that do want to get off meds?
Oh, there are many resources available now. And I have some of the resources on my website, which is called Deadly Medicines in plural and in one word. It's very easy to find. We had our first course last year that took a whole day. So the lectures are up on YouTube, and we have practical tips and tricks how you divide tablets and capsules in smaller and smaller bits when you're tapering patients off. We have an abstinence chart where you can follow your abstinence symptoms day by day and give them points from 1 to 10, I think it is. And you can also be prepared for what you might encounter when you start tapering off, so that you know what to expect, so that it's easier for you to come through it. And we have a list of people in many countries who are willing to help people come off psychiatric drugs. And there are other websites and other initiatives. There's also one in Sweden, and there are several in the United States where people can actually learn something by going to these websites, so they can try slowly tapering off their first patients. What is most important is to give the patients psychological support during the withdrawal phase. So some of the people I know who are doing this, they give the patients their phone number and then tell them, you can call me at any time, even in the middle of the night. And you know, the fact is, they are almost never used, these telephone numbers, but it gives people calmness in their mind to go through what they need to go through. And psychiatrists and psychologists and others who have weaned off a large number of patients from psychiatric drugs, all of them tell me it's generally far more difficult to do this than to stop heroin in a heroin addict. The abstinence symptoms are over quite quickly if you stop heroin. That's not the case with psychiatric drugs. They're far worse.
Yeah, for me, my personal story took me 1.5 years to wean
off.
off.
Have been through that? You have been through this?
Yeah.
Oh my God, what kind of drug was that?
I was on Lamictal and I was on Seroquel.
Oh, an anti-epilepsy drug.
Yeah, but I'm not epileptic. Go figure.
No, but anti-epileptic drugs have no place in psychiatry whatsoever.
Yeah.
They make it difficult for people to function. And do you know that they double the risk of suicide? They do.
I didn't know that. No.
No, it's horrible that these drugs are used in psychiatry. And Seroquel is also a horrible drug. This is a neuroleptic drug that is now even used for depression. These drug companies just cannot get enough. They also drug our children.
Actually, that was going to be the next thing I wanted to ask you about was psychiatric drugs with children. What have you seen in your studies? I mean, I know that ADHD medication is a big one, but it seems like all of them, anxiety, depression, all these things kids are being diagnosed with. What have you seen with regards to kids in school with them?
Well, the short version is that I have come to the conclusion that children should not be treated with psychiatric drugs. Full stop. Then there can be some very rare cases where you might consider treatment for a very short period of time. But the problem with doctors is that if you allow some exceptions, then these exceptions tend to be the norm. So then suddenly everybody becomes treated. So therefore, the most rational thing to do would be to forbid psychiatric drugs for children altogether. If we did that, it would create far more good than harm.
Right. So what about the next group of trapped people that I want to ask? You have children, and then you also have inmates that are in prisons that it seems like they get, in many cases coerced and forced onto medications. Did you come across that type of data in your research as well about people in prisons?
We don't have so much experience with prisoners as you have in the States. I think you are the worst, one of the absolutely worst countries in the world, considering the number of imprisoned people per 1 million inhabitants. It is so many times more than what we do in Europe that it's beyond our imagination. We don't have so many people in prison, so we don't have so much experience from prisons as you have. So if you want to study that, then do it in America, please. That's much easier than in Europe. But of course, we have some data from Europe, but it hasn't been my focus of research. I have not taken an interest in this, but prisoners are no different than other people with respect to psychiatric drugs. They are harmful in all people if they are used for longer than a short period of time.
Yeah, it seems like they're using them to more control their population inside.
Yes, exactly so. They are much being used to control people. And you know about this, if somebody is disturbing, whether it's in a prison or in a closed ward, then you can give something to calm that patient down. So sometimes, actually quite often, you give psychiatric drugs for the benefit of the staff and not the patients, and for the benefit of other patients who might be disturbed by all that noise.
Right. There was another category that you had written about, which is dementia, which I don't know much about dementia. Can you tell me a little bit about what you found in your research about psychiatric drugs that were used to treat people with dementia. And I don't know, is this traditionally in nursing homes? Are people being treated outside of hospitals for dementia with drugs?
They're being treated for dementia everywhere, but the drugs don't work. I have looked into these Cochrane reviews on dementia drugs and read some of the trial reports as well. And I have come to the clear conclusion these drugs don't work at all. These trials are also flawed, of course, because the studies have not been adequately blinded. And even so, what you measure in these trials is far less than what is clinically relevant. And therefore, my conclusion is when the effect is so small that it's not clinically relevant, it means that the drugs don't work.
And what kind of harm are these drugs doing to people that are taking them?
Oh, they're doing lots of harm. People who get dementia drugs, they may get tired, they may get confused, and they can develop a lot of other harms. They may lose appetite. That's not good for an old person who may eat very little already. And if you get confused, you might fall and break your hip, and then 20% will be dead within the next year. So I haven't seen the statistics on this, but given the side effects of dementia drugs, it is beyond doubt that they kill some people. I don't know how many they kill, but you should not use drugs that are harmful and that have no relevant benefit. Full stop. It's just wrong.
Wow. So I like to say that it's been great talking with people that I interview, but so often the topics are kind of dark and morbid in a way. But are there any other things that you would want to share with people about the research that you've done on psychiatry
Yes.
and even pharma in general?
Yes. I have also psychologists as PhD students, and some of them are studying psychotherapy. My daughter is studying psychology, and she and I did a meta-analysis of psychotherapy for preventing suicides. So there were these trials, all of them, of people acutely admitted after a suicide attempt. And then they were randomized to some psychotherapy or treatment as usual, which doesn't mean that you don't talk to people. You also try to help them, but not by using some specific type of psychotherapy. And what we found was that psychotherapy halved the risk of a new suicide attempt. This is a dramatic effect. And then what do? We use depression pills that increase the risk of suicide with no upper age limit. It's not only in children and adolescents. There is no age limit. So we use pills that increase the risk of suicide, violence, and in the worst case, homicide, instead of using psychotherapy that could actually really help people. So if this is going to be my final remark for this interview, I would love to end on this positive note.
Yeah, actually, let me, while you're bringing that up, let me ask one question. What can you tell me about open dialogue therapy?
It's a very, very interesting concept that was developed in the Finnish part of Lapland in northern Finland. Unfortunately, it has not been compared to neuroleptics in randomized trials, but I have been told that such trials are ongoing in some countries, but the results obtained in Finland are so much better than, for example, the results obtained in similar patients in Stockholm, that you cannot just discard these results by saying that this was not a randomized comparison, because these patients were very similar. They all had psychosis, acute psychosis, but in Finland, instead of using neuroleptics, they have a team of people who meet with the patient within the first 24 hours, a team typically consisting of a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and family members, and so on. And then they take care of the patient, talk to the patient, instead of drugging the patient. And after 5 years, quite few people in Finland had been treated with neuroleptics compared to almost everyone in Stockholm. And many, many more people were back at work in Finland than in Stockholm, for example. This difference was absolutely dramatic. So my personal view is that this is the way forward. And there are also randomized trials that show that psychotherapy works for psychosis and schizophrenia.
All right, great. So if anyone watching has any desire to follow up with you and learn more about your work, where are the best places for them to track down your books and information about the Cochrane Collaboration?
Well, my website, they can find a lot of information there, also about my books, and there are videos of a number of my talks and links to other things, links to interesting films that are freely available about psychiatry. So this is the website, deadlymedicines.dk. So DK means Denmark. So it's very easy to find. And the Nordic Cochrane Center, of which I'm the director, is equally easy to find. Just Google Nordic Cochrane Center, you have it immediately.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for being willing to share all your wisdom and experience with us today. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for contacting me.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter.